Well, hello from Magical Mystery Talk, a regular series of podcasts looking at topical and timely developments and happenings of a Beatles-related flavour from an occult conspiratorial angle. And what you're listening to right now is the bonus edition of a John Lennon special marking the 40th year since the events that took place outside his home at the Dakota in New York on December 8th, 1980. Of course, as you may indeed already know, if you've heard it already, the previous edition of this Lennon special focused on both the mainstream and alternative reports and theories of what happened on that day back in 1980 when Mark David Chapman came face to face with John Lennon. The previous edition of this Lennon special also looked a bit into Chapman's not so widely reported background, including his possible links to the CIA and the attempted assassination of US President Ronald Reagan. Also, the previous edition of this Lennon special looked a bit into the shady resume of the chief medical examiner who was in charge of Lennon's autopsy report at the time, and which is still yet to be released in full to the public, as well as the possibility that there was another shooter or shooters present with Chapman, including a man by the name of Jose Perdomo. If you haven't yet listened to that previous edition, then please do. And also included in that previous edition is, of course, my fellow Magical Mystery Talk co-host, Mark Devlin. Unfortunately, he can't make it for this bonus edition, where we're going to go in deeper. But also here with me now is the proprietor of the Beatles Number 9 blog and Magical Mystery Talk fellow host, Desiree Hall. Hi, Desiree, all right?
Hello, hello.
Hello, hello. Yeah, the first edition was pretty jam-packed in itself, and we kind of came to a decision after recording it that there was still so much more to record. There's just so much more. I don't know about you.
We could probably talk for months about it, honestly.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, I don't know about you, but my intention for going ahead with this bonus edition is, what I want to try and do, I don't know if we'll succeed in doing it, but I suppose we can have a bloody good try at it, is to kind of put together a comprehensive kind of summary of everything that's been explored over the last 40 years, the theories and the investigations and the claims and the reports. I don't know if we'll get there by doing this two-parter, this bonus, and putting together this bonus edition, but yeah, that's my intention for doing this anyway.
We can try.
We can try. Shame Mark's not here, but okay. Well, if you recall in the one that we did with Mark, the Magical Mystery Talk that we did with Mark about the Lennon assassination, we kind of began by talking about Mark David Chapman and this narrative that seems to fit next to him. For example, every time over the last 40 years, I've certainly read and heard this, but when you hear the name Mark David Chapman in the mainstream, you always get the news announcer or the news article will always follow it with the tagline, Mark David Chapman, the man who was seeking to become famous from shooting John Lennon. That's right. always the kind of the regular mainstream explanation, the tagline, if you like.
Right.
And we kind of looked a bit into that when we were chatting with Mark, and the kind of like the inconsistencies with that official version. For example, the fact that he pleaded guilty, which meant that there was no trial, and surely, as we discussed, you know, in this previous podcast, surely if he was looking to become famous, then one great way of doing that is to say not guilty, and to then automatically gain the advantage, if you like, to become famous, as it were. Because by getting a trial, as many commentators have said, if there had been a trial, it would have been the trial of the century, perhaps. And it would have been on TV, it would have had wall-to-wall blanket coverage, 24-hour news, you know, the works. But he didn't want that. He turned away from that. And also, there's the fact that in 40 years, he's only taken part in something like, maybe, I might be wrong, but I think it's maybe 4 or 5 interviews, media interviews, something like that.
Yeah.
And he's also said he's also said with regards to him seeking fame, which is odd because he's actually he's actually contradicting. Anyway, he's actually contradicted that claim that he's seeking fame. He's actually said himself a few years back, he said, I turn away 30 to 40 invitations from the media a year.
Right.
So
He specifically says he wasn't out for fame. That wasn't his intention.
Yeah.
So he's completely denied that accusation altogether.
And there's also a quote from Arthur O'Connor, who was the commander officer of the detectives at the police precinct on the night of the event, and he's been quoted as saying it is definitely illogical to say Mark committed the murder to make himself famous. He didn't want to talk to the press from the very start. He didn't want the press. He didn't encourage it. He did not want the notoriety. He did not want the glory of a trial either. So, when you've got police officers who are, dealing with a case saying things like that, as well as Mark David Chapman, it's all a bit inconsistent, really.
Right.
And there's... Yeah, go on, because I was going to say there's some other taglines that have been attached to the reasons behind Mark David Chapman.
When we wouldn't even know because it didn't go to trial, and so he's never really given an official statement except for, a passage out of Catcher in the Rye. That's all he's really said in a court setting whatsoever. So, we don't really know his side of the story. And since it didn't go to trial, we don't know anyone's side of the story. So... who really knows exactly what happened? And it's interesting too that he got second degree. He was charged with second degree murder.
Yeah.
Which, he pled guilty to shooting John Lennon. I mean, and he obviously planned it. So it was obviously, at least in my opinion, premeditated murder, which would be first degree murder. But yet he was charged with second degree murder, like he didn't plan it. It's just all very strange. None of it makes much sense.
It's inconsistent, isn't it? It's completely inconsistent.
Mm-hmm.
The other tagline that you get with Mark David Chapman is he was a loner. That's another one I've always heard, that he was this kind of lonely figure who had no friends. He was socially inept. He was a bit of a weirdo. Basically what the mainstream is trying to build up with that narrative, with that tagline, is I suppose that he's a weirdo, that he's a bit nuts. Right. But again, that flies in the face because he was deemed mentally fit to stand trial. If there had been a trial, he was mentally tested before by psychiatrists prior to him pleading, and he was found to be fit to stand. Right. So there was no mental illness there. There was no psychosis as such.
No, and he wasn't really a loner much either. He was married.
No. Yeah.
He had, at least it seemed like he did have some struggles in there, at least from the information that we've been able to gather. But, he was with the YMCA and he was with the World Vision and he did world traveling and, he seemed to be a somewhat at least normal type person. It wasn't anything like the media had portrayed.
And apparently with the YMCA thing, he was a camp counsellor, and I think he was dealing with children, wasn't he? He was like a summer camp for kids. Right. And from some of the statements I've heard from the children that were there with him, he was like this Pied Piper. They loved him. He was very easygoing with children. And again, this flies in the face of this scary, weirdo loner type thing. But he could connect with children. And normally children, I don't know if this is true, but they do say, but it could be true that children, very, very young children, have this ability to be able to. They've got a bullshit detector. Basically, they can kind of detect vibrations in an adult, whether to stay away from them or whether to go to them. They have that kind of. With adulthood, I suppose it kind of gets stripped away from them. But if that is the case, then that's, again, it doesn't fit, does it? It doesn't fit with Mark David Chapman's supposed, image of being this, kind of weirdo that should be kept, at arm's length. I mean, they called him Nemo, didn't they? That was his nickname with the kids, Nemo, Captain Nemo. So again, it's all a bit, I know, and I've collected together loads of bits of info for our chats that we've been having, as I mentioned earlier. Loads of bits of I've printed out loads of stuff from various articles and books and stuff, and to read and to take a look at, because there is so much to remember. I've got I've got a memory like a sieve at most times, so I really do need to do this in order to remember what I've got to say and not to get my facts wrong. And I was looking through rereading Fenton Bresler's book, which is kind of like, actually I've got it here in front of me because I've forgotten the title. The Murder of John Lennon, that's it, and it was it was published in 1989, I think it was. It's out of print now, but I think you can get it second hand, and if anyone hasn't read that book and they're into this kind of stuff, I personally would recommend people buy this. I mean, considering it came out in 1989, first off, Fenton Bresler was a lawyer. I think he was a barrister, and he was also an author and a journalist, a newspaper journalist. And basically, this is kind of like where we get a lot of it's kind of like the foundation stone for anyone who's into conspiracies, and especially to do with MK Ultra and mind control. This is kind of like, if you're looking at the circumstances around the John Lennon assassination, this is kind of the book where most authors and researchers have their foundation, because it was the first to do it. And what's so good about this book, I think, is he's writing about Mark David Chapman being a mind-controlled puppet and MK Ultra and the CIA long before the days of the internet. We're talking 1980, so this is long before the days of the internet, when that kind of research became, as it is now, kind of widespread. We have an alternative media now, so it's more widespread. But back in those days, it wasn't such a hot topic. So he was kind of like a pioneer in that respect. And what's also good about this book is he did the legwork. He actually went out there and interviewed Mark Chapman's friends, his work, his employees at all the various places he worked. He spoke to the police officers, the lawyers, the investigators. So quite a bit of the information I've got here in front of me now comes from that book. And with regards to Chapman being quote unquote a loner, Fenton Bresler went and interviewed a lot of these people that went to school with Mark David Chapman back in the day, and also who worked with him, who were his friends basically. And I've got some key words here, key words that I've picked out from some of the quotes from some of the people that knew Mark David Chapman that Bresler had spoken to back then in the 1980s. And they talk about someone who was talkative, popular, and with the girls as well. Popular with the girls. He was outgoing, gentle, and other words I've got is protective, loving, and nurturing. These are other words I picked up. So again, it just flies in the face of this narrative that we always get when we talk about Mark David Chapman being this crazed loner. And that's the other thing, isn't it? This crazed Beatles fan. That's the other tag we always get. Mark David Chapman, crazed lone nut Beatles fan, crazed Beatles fan. It's always, but that's not so true either by the looks of things. For example, again, from Fenton Bresler's book, I've got a quote here from a school friend who says, he, Mark, never expressed strong views on the Beatles or Lennon to me. All of his feelings, very strong feelings I might add, towards Lennon and the Beatles, were new to me when I heard of them in 1980. To me, he never expressed a dislike or made any comment at all that I remember. And then there's also Captain Louis L. Sousa of the Honolulu Police, because, as we mentioned in the earlier podcast, Mark lived and worked in Hawaii for quite a time, which is very heavy in military bases. I don't recall if we mentioned that, but it's a place that's very heavy in military bases. It's got one of the highest concentration of military bases in the US. Anyway, Sousa of the Honolulu Police spent over a month inquiring into Lennon's murder and into Mark's background, and he told Fenton Bresler, I did not come to the opinion that he was a Lennon nut. it appeared like he was just the opposite. He was not particularly in favour of that type of music. He was not a particular fan of John Lennon. He did not express any views on Lennon. He didn't talk about him. And there's also a quote from the book, where is it? Yeah, John Lennon, Life, Times and Assassination by author Phil Strongman. And he writes, and I quote, that Chapman, the supposed Lennon obsessive and fan of fans, quote unquote, did not own one Lennon single, book or album, not one. That is, until he bought that copy of Double Fantasy that he got Paul Goresh to sign. And it appears to me that, again, we've got this weird kind of discourse with what's being said in the mainstream and what we're, what the actual truth might be. And then there's this wife, Gloria, who tells us that actually the artist that he really loved, that he really, really got into, was Todd Rundgren. She says the musical artist, she was quoted by author Jack Jones for a book, I think, that came out a few years back. And she says the musical artist that had the greatest influence on Mark wasn't John Lennon, it was Todd Rundgren. Mark often told me that he believed Rundgren was a true musical genius. He has had at least 2 complete Rundgren collections at separate times, but he got very depressed listening to the music. He said it depressed him to hear music that good. And one of Mark's childhood friends by the name of Mark McManus has been quoted as saying, Mark totally worshipped Todd Rundgren. He knew every word to every song. And Chapman himself has said, right between the chambers of your heart is how Rundgren's music is to me. I cannot overestimate the depth of what his music meant to me. So Todd Rundgren, by the looks of it, is the guy that he really went for. Right. I don't know if I've got some more to say about that. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but I've got some more kind of Rundgren themes that actually might fit into some other kind of stuff. Weird stuff.
Not too much. I believe Todd Rundgren had a large estate in Hawaii, if I'm not mistaken.
Ah.
So yeah, in Hawaii, I believe he lived there. So.
Oh wow. Yeah. Wow. Do you know what I mean? It's like, what? Okay, well, hold that thought, okay, because if you recall when we spoke last with Mark in the previous podcast of this Lennon special, we talked about Catcher in the Rye and Holden Caulfield, the character in this novel, The Catcher in the Rye, who is fixated on phoniness and phonies. And we also talked about Mark David Chapman, who fixated onto the book The Catcher in the Rye in 1980. I think he borrowed it from a library initially, and that's what we're thinking it was the trigger book, his trigger book, basically, his mind-controlled book. And we also picked up on the fact that, or we also mentioned the fact that at the same time that he bought that book and was reading that book, he also bought a couple of books about John Lennon, and they were kind of books about John Lennon as his life was in the late 70s. So we're talking here about a very rich, wealthy rock star who has, countless properties. He has amassed great wealth. Here he is living in splendour and wealth, as these books are said to have outlined Lennon to Mark David Chapman as he was reading them. And then Mark David Chapman supposedly picked up on the phoniness of John Lennon from that. Because he thought to himself, well, hey, wait a minute, I thought John Lennon was meant to be this peace lover who fought against the man, against the establishment, and here he is living like a king. That's a bit phony.
Imagine no possessions.
Imagine no possessions, yeah, exactly. And then fixating on the phoniness with the Holden Caulfield idea of phoniness, of course. And, of course, you've got the trigger book and everything. So, so as I say, hold the thought of the Hawaii thing, and because... Okay, there have been claims, and I don't know if you've heard of this. I haven't been able to confirm this. There's a couple of reports, I think, maybe 1 or 2 reports, that Chapman actually was convinced that Rundgren had sent him, quote unquote, signals. Okay, And the other claim, and I don't know if you've been able to, if you've heard of this or been able to check this out, and I read about this years ago, and for the life of me, I can't find anything else out about it. Apparently, and this is according to a couple of reputable news sources, Chapman was wearing a Todd Rundgren T-shirt on the day of the shooting.
Oh, I have never heard that, no.
Right.
How interesting is that? Huh.
And did you know about the hotel room, about the bureau in his hotel room?
I'm not sure. Remind me.
There's a bureau in his hotel room, and it had, on the bureau, it had a copy of his album. A copy of Rundgren's album ceremoniously displayed on his hotel room bureau. And this is the hotel room, by the way, in New York. On the night of the shooting, he was staying at a hotel. He was staying at a YMCA before that, and then he moved into a hotel after that. And he left a load of tokens and little things on his bureau, and that's what the police found. They found this copy of one of Todd Rundgren's albums. And there's another thing, and this is to do with the phoniness thing again. I did a little bit of background on Todd Rundgren, and I found this letter that he sent to the British music magazine Melody Maker in 1974, in which he attacks Lennon, and it just sounds like it could have come out of a Holden Caulfield book. This is what the letter says. It says, "John Lennon ain't no revolutionary. He's an effing idiot, man, shouting about revolution and acting like an arse. It just makes people feel uncomfortable. All he really wants to do is get attention for himself. And if revolution gets him that attention, he'll get attention through revolution. He's an important figure, sure, but so was Richard Nixon. Nixon was just like another generation's John Lennon, someone who represented all sorts of ideals, but was out for himself underneath it all along." And there's also a song that came out on the album A Wizard, A True Star, Rundgren's album, and I think that's the actual album that was on the bureau. And there's a song on there called Rock and Roll Pussy, and apparently that's about John Lennon, and it's a dig at John Lennon and his bed-ins. I've got the lyrics here. They're not very long. The lyrics are: beat it, beat your guitar, smash it till it sees stars, rip it to shreds, throw down your axe and then jump into bed. Get up and see revolution on the TV. Will you get your nails dirty, or are you only just a rock and roll pussy? So, yeah, I don't know what you make of that, but there's all this kind of weird kind of correlations.
Yeah. That makes the most sense out of anything that I've heard. That Mark David Chapman was really obsessed with Rundgren and not John Lennon at all. That's very interesting.
So would I be reaching if I was to say that maybe Rundgren was the actual trigger?
I don't think, not with that information, not at all. It was almost like Hinckley Jr. there and his obsession with Jodie Foster. Right, it kind of has a resonation there. They're kind of similar stories, and if you look at it from that point of view,
yeah. And other things that were found on that hotel bureau, and this takes us even more into the realms of mind control, I suppose. If you're looking at it that way, is obviously there was references to Holden Caulfield. There was a pocket Bible on the bureau, apparently, and where it was inscribed Holden Caulfield, and where it said the gospel on the page where it was the gospel according to John, it had been amended to read the gospel. Well, I suppose you can guess, the gospel according to John Lennon, and there was also a picture of Judy Garland and the Cowardly Lion, like a movie still. And this takes us into the realms, am I reaching here, of Wizard of Oz?
No, not at all.
So,
right. Which has also been said to been used as a mind control agent as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was Kathy O'Brien in her book Transformation of America through Mind Control. Kathy O'Brien, of course, is a whistleblower, if you like. She's a self-confessed mind control MK Ultra victim who got out of it so she says, and she wrote this book, Transformation of America, and in that book, she claims that one of the devices that was used in which to control, she was in it from childhood, and from her childhood, she was like a childhood slave through into adulthood until she broke out. And she says that in her childhood, that what people such as herself, MK Ultra slaves, programming that was used was fiction, to take them into a fictional world. And one of the fictional tales was Disney, and of course Wizard of Oz as well. So yeah, so and there's also that one of the very few TV appearances that he made. I think it was in 1988. I've got a quote here during a TV interview. He said, and he's talking about the moment that he supposedly shot Lennon. He said, "I looked at Lennon and he walked past me, and then I heard in my head a voice saying, 'Do it, do it, do it,' over and over again. 'Do it, do it, do it, do it,' like that." So he pulled the gun out of his pocket and pulled the trigger. And he also told Barbara Walters in 1992 the similar thing. He said, "I heard this voice saying over and over, 'Do it, do it, do it, do it.' So I pulled the .38 revolver out of my pocket." That's what he said during that interview. And even the aforementioned Arthur O'Connor, he told Fenton Bresler, he said to Fenton Bresler, and I quote, this is from the book, "It's possible Mark could have been used by somebody." He says, and I quote, "I saw him the night of the murder. I studied him intensely. He looked as if he could have been programmed. That was the way he looked, and that was the way he talked. It could have been drugs, and no, we did not test for drugs. It was not standard procedure. But looking back, he could have been either drugged or programmed, or a combination of both." So that's what he's saying. This is a police officer. So we've got him. So we've got Chapman standing. We were told that he shot Lennon, and then he pulled out a copy of Catcher in the Rye and began to read it. That's his trigger book. And I've got another quote here, again from Arthur O'Connor. It's amazing, actually, how one cop has been so candid and honest about this kind of conspiracy thing. Again, from Fenton Bresler's book. He says to Bresler, and I quote, "As far as you are trying to build up some kind of conspiracy, I would support you in that line. If Mark wanted to get away with it, he could have got away with it." This is what I think we mentioned this in the previous podcast, that he could have run away. There was the subway right on the corner and no one around to stop him. But he remained on the scene voluntarily. He had a 75% chance, says Arthur O'Connor, in his book, in his estimations, of never being apprehended, but he wanted to get caught. I don't remember if we mentioned that in the first podcast, but yeah, he just stood there, and he could have run either direction, left, right, forwards, back.
He could have disappeared into Central Park, which is right across the street. He could have taken the subway. There were, I'm sure, the taxi cabs that were parked right there probably wouldn't have picked him up. But I mean, there were several ways he could have just snuck off into the night. This is like 11 o'clock at night, and New York City, bustling city, and he could have easily just slipped away.
I'm not coming from the States myself. I'm not too familiar with New York. I'd love to go one day, but what is New York like at around that time of night? Is it busy? I mean, would that area near Central Park, would that have been busy and bustling on a December night at that kind of time?
So if you read it, you'll find that supposedly on that night, December 8th, it's going into winter. It's heavy fall there, and it does get very cold in New York City. But if you read it, it'll say, it was many people made the remark, it was a very warm December evening for that time. It was an unusually warm night. And New York City always has people walking about. Now at 11 o'clock at night, probably a little less. But still, at the same time, a lot of people take the subway. A lot of people just walk. A lot of people hail cabs. Not a lot of people own cars because the traffic is just completely ridiculous there. So a lot of people just walk or take the subway or other alternative ways of getting around town. So yes, there's should be plenty of people around. It's called the city that never sleeps for a reason because it's always hustling and bustling, and millions of people live in New York City. So in some ways it's odd because, we only have a handful of witnesses that were there that evening, and nobody that really saw everything that was happening. But at the same time, being that it was 11 o'clock at night, it was a Monday night, there might not be quite as many people as you would see, but see normally anyways. But, the point is he could have easily slipped away. He could have easily, just gone down into the subway system, which is literally right there on the corner. He could have easily slipped into Central Park and, made himself invisible just with the other people that might have been in there. And he could have easily slipped away. There was no reason really for him to just stick around unless, like you said, he wanted to get caught.
And it's just dawned on me, there were always fans standing outside the Dakota, wasn't there? There was always a group of people. And then this goes back to the Beatles days. There's the so-called Apple Scruffs, who used to stand outside Abbey Road Studios every day in the late 60s. They would just stand outside hoping even for a 1-minute glimpse of George Harrison walking down the stairs to his car, leaving the studio and driving off. And that would be enough for them, hoping that he might stop and speak to them. And that kind of carried on. And they'd stand outside the Apple building, the Beatles company, on Savile Row, and then that happened at the Dakota. But I don't know, but is it because it was late? But we don't seem to... It's like there was always... Is it me, or am I seeing it wrong? But the impression that I get is that there were always fans standing outside the Dakota waiting for John, and then on this night, we don't...
There wasn't.
Where were they?
Right. So Paul Goresh was always there, the photographer. He was there quite often, and he had gone home. And I believe that Mark David Chapman had dinner with one of the fans. Gosh, I'm not recalling her name at the moment. I think it was Jessica, something like that. A fan that was always posted out there in front of the Dakota as well. They actually went and had dinner. He had just gotten back from dinner before this had happened. So obviously he wasn't, and that goes again to show you that he wasn't quite as socially awkward as one might seem. He made quick friends with one of the fans that was always posted out there at the Dakota. He just had dinner with her. So, yeah, very, very odd.
Yeah.
It does seem very strange that there weren't more people around and that there weren't more witnesses to what transpired that evening.
Yeah, popular with the ladies. That's what's
right.
Yeah, it's not easy for a guy to just walk up to someone standing outside on a sidewalk and say, "Do you want to come for a meal?" when you've never met the girl.
Right.
And he pulled it off. So he's got some talents.
Right.
So it suggests then that possibly something happened, something switched in his brain. For example, I've got a People magazine article here I think we mentioned this in the first podcast, that one of the few interviews that he took part in was for People magazine in 1987, I think it was. And he says in this, "I never wanted to hurt anybody. My friends will tell you that. I have two parts in me. The big part is very kind. I have a small part in me that cannot understand the world and what goes on in it. I did not want to kill anybody, and I really don't know why I did it." Also, he was visited whilst he was being held, awaiting the trial that never happened and his sentencing. He was visited by a reverend, an ex-pastor friend of his, because Mark was a very kind of devout Christian, we're told. And he spoke. He visited Mark, and after he came out of the prison where Mark was, he told a journalist that that Mark had said to him, "I do not understand why I did it. I just gave in. It was almost as if I was on some kind of special mission that I could not avoid.
Right.
Again, we've also talked about Bernard Diamond, one of the psychiatrists who examined Sirhan. We've talked about that. I think there were altogether, eight or nine psychiatrists who were assigned by the judge to examine Mark David Chapman before the sentencing to see if he was fit to stand in court. As we said earlier, and another of those, apart from the infamous Bernard Diamond, was a guy by the name of Milton Kline, and it would appear, from what I've been able to muster up, it would appear that Kline had been a consultant for the CIA on a behaviour modification project, Project Bluebird. And I found that you can find documents about Project Bluebird. There are some freedom of information documents available, heavily redacted in places, of course. I found one that dates back to 1950, and apparently Project Bluebird was a project to utilise, and I quote, polygraph, drugs and hypnotism to attain the greatest results in interrogation techniques. It is and this is what it says: it is important that this project be established in so much as a considerable public and government interest has recently developed in the use of hypnotism for interrogation and for personality control purposes. And one of the aims of this project, from another declassified document that you can find online, this one's from 1952, and this is to do with Project Bluebird, was, and I quote, to obtain control of the activities, physical and mental, of any given individual, willing or unwilling, by application of techniques. And Kline has been quoted as saying, on whether a Manchurian candidate can be created, he's actually quoted as saying, whether this is true, I haven't been able to verify this quote. It's featured in a book. It cannot be done by everyone. It cannot be done consistently, but it can be done. And another psychiatrist who examined Mark David Chapman was Dr. Dorothy Lewis, who at the time was a research professor of psychiatry at the University School of Medicine in New York. And she concluded that, and I quote, Chapman harboured ideas that could be classified psychotic, but added also that he might have been acting in response to a command hallucination on the day that the shooting took place. There's another weird thing that happened. He was all set. Mark David Chapman was actually originally set to plead not guilty.
Right. By means of insanity.
By means of insanity. That's what his lawyer was trying to get in court. And then, and I think the date for the commencement of the trial was set for June 22nd of 81, I think. And then it was sometime in early June that Chapman contacted his lawyer and said that he changed his mind and he was going to plead guilty because he'd heard voices in his head that God had told him to plead guilty. Right. And Fenton Bresler makes the case that, I don't know if it's true now, I don't think this is the case in the UK, and I don't think it's ever been the case, but I don't know if it's changed in the US since Fenton Bresler's book came out. But apparently in America, if you're a prisoner, you can make phone calls anytime you like. Pretty much, it's a pretty much open thing. You can receive phone calls, take phone calls. There is this suggestion that Fenton Bresler makes that perhaps a command was sent to Mark via the phone, because you can send. So researchers have found triggers can be sent through the telephone. I don't know if that's true, but it's something that Fenton Bresler's put forward.
Something to keep in mind, most definitely. I think, like an audible trigger is most definitely something that they have used in the past for hypnosis, for example, as a trigger to get them to do something, just a simple word or a phrase, or even visual clues as well. Certain patterns, or the woman in the red dress, like the Matrix, and all those
Yeah,
kinds of
and
things.
Sirhan,
So,
the polka dot dress, and
right, exactly, yeah. So audible and visual triggers is at least what's been proposed to be the trigger to make somebody go into a different state of mind, or to say a certain thing, or to do whatever it was that they were programmed to do.
and there's also that spell. I mean, we talked in the first podcast about in the previous podcast about looking at Mark David Chapman's background and possible telltale clues. His father was in the US military, so you've got that possibility that maybe Mark had been kind of like fostered or adopted, not literally adopted by his parents, but chosen.
Yeah,
Yeah, one of the chosen
right.
ones. And then there was a spell when he was about 14 or 15 where he got into acid as well. He was taking a lot of drugs, and he got into taking a lot of LSD and various other, which again might suggest that something was going on, because I think it was 1969. Yeah, sure, okay, in 1969, I dare say, I didn't live through it, but I dare say a lot of teenagers in 1969, the so-called counterculture, would have been taking drugs and would have wished to have lived the life of a rock star hippie. It was very in at the time. It was if you were a young teenager at that time, that's perhaps what you would have wanted to aspire to in some way, shape, or form.
And supposedly the CIA was just passing them out to everyone
exactly,
free of charge.
Exactly. So there you've got. So there you've got Chapman taking loads of it, and apparently he said, in his own words, he was a garbage user. He was a garbage head. I think is another term he used for himself. He was sniffing glue, lighter fluid, smoking dope, snorting cocaine, bit of heroin, uppers, downers, and also LSD. And then there's this weird. I think he was having a vacation from school that year when he was 14, 15. I think he was 14, actually.
69, he'd be 14, yeah.
1955 he was born, so yeah. So he ran away for two weeks or a week. He ran away from home, and he came back, and he didn't tell his parents where he'd gone. So he got this guy who's strung out on LSD, and he runs away for a week or 2 weeks, I can't remember which, but still 14 years of age, running away for a week.
Right.
And he never told his parents where he'd gone, and they assumed that he'd gone to California. He told them no, he went to Miami. I don't know what I know there's mob connections in Miami. Back in those days, there would have been that kind of thing going on. I don't know what the CIA presence or military presence in Miami would have been at around that time. I don't know if you've got any ideas about that. But
not too much. I know that it was a big Cuban refugee type area from the Cold War, but I don't know too many details on that.
So again, we've got this Cuba thing coming in. It just seems a bit weird that he could have gone away for a week, or maybe I think it was 2 weeks, a week. I can't quite remember. How does a 14-year-old, survive in Miami on his own for 2 weeks? How does he eat? Where does he sleep?
Right.
How did he get there? How did he come back? I'm surprised he never got accosted by anyone, like I don't know, sexual predators or whatever. I don't know.
Sure.
Drug dealers, anything. It just doesn't quite. I don't know. It just doesn't quite. Again, it doesn't quite compute to me what was going on there. So again, you've got this possibility that something weird, untoward was going on there. With regards to what was to happen years later. But
sure.
What do you think of Fenton Bresler's book? By the way, do you?
I think it was amazing. It was really the first book to, he was the first person to really question kind of what was going on. And I still believe, I think he got a lot of kind of poo-poo around it from Beatles fans and whatnot, simply because people don't really want to hear alternative answers to what may or may not have happened. But it was an absolutely genius of a book, in my opinion. I thought it was amazing. So it's definitely the definitive. It's still, even now, it's still the definitive version of the alternative possibilities of what might have actually happened rather than what we've been told. But even so much has come out since that book was published that kind of still goes in line with what Bresler had said in that book. And it still holds up to this day, even though it's 32 years old now, at least something like that, 30 years old. So yeah, it absolutely amazing. I quote it often in my articles and my blogs because really he was the one that did all of that footwork, since there wasn't really an investigation and there wasn't a trial, and we didn't really get much information as far as official information from interviews being, or witnesses being interviewed and all that. He's really the first and almost the only one who has gone to such lengths to do that. So yeah, absolutely amazing.
Okay, well, forgive me. I've got to quote some more from his book because, like you say, he did the legwork and he found out so much stuff that only someone who does the legwork is going to find out, i.e. by going to the actual headquarters of a police precinct and speaking to the people who were involved, or looking at official papers and scouring through various documents that you can only get through legwork. It goes beyond sitting at a computer and typing in a search engine and trying to kind of come up with a theory or something. And I there's a couple of things here I really do I feel like I have to mention because they're like glaring anomalies, and this is one of the reasons that I really wanted us to do a bonus edition of this, because it really gets in deep. I'm going to try and it's a bit complicated, so I'll try and keep my head. I'll try and say it as clearly as I possibly can because it is a bit convoluted. And it's to do with where before the shooting, Mark David Chapman kind of flitted from Hawaii, where he was based, to New York, and then he came back, and then he went back again. There was this kind of backwards and forwards thing going on. I think the first time he went to New York was in November. I think he bought a gun in Hawaii on October 27th, according to Fenton Bresley. He bought it on October 27th, 1980. He walked into a gun shop in Hawaii, bought the gun, and then he bought a one-way ticket to New York. So he went to New York, and he didn't take any bullets with him. And apparently the reason, as you probably know, the reason he didn't take any bullets with him was because he claims that he had this fear that the bullets would explode on the plane due to the air pressure. So what he figured, so what he figured he'd do is he'd go to New York and buy the bullets from there. But when he got to New York, apparently the gun laws then in New York, I don't know if they're the same now, if they still apply now, but back then you couldn't buy bullets if you didn't have a gun permit for New York. So what he then figured was to go to Atlanta, which is somewhere where he used to live and work. And he went to Atlanta to see someone by the name of Gene Scott, I think his name is, who was a friend of his, and who was a sheriff's officer, so kind of like an equivalent of a police officer, if you like. So he went to see this friend of his, Gene Scott, to get some bullets off him. And this friend of his willingly obliged. Fenton Breslin came up with all this. He's implying, when he's putting this together, when he's explaining it in the book, he's implying that Gene Scott is not a very he's a bit of an unsavoury character. But I get the feeling that he's not saying it. Okay, he's not expressing it. Fenton Breslin isn't expressing that feeling in the book, but he kind of like tiptoes around wanting to kind of say it. And the feeling I get is that he doesn't. Is maybe it's a theory of getting sued, that Gene Scott might sue him, because I think he uses a different name for Gene. He doesn't actually use Gene's name in the book. So I get this feeling that he's a bit nervous of getting sued for libel or slander or whatever, because he kind of makes the case in the book, or he kind of explains in the book, that Gene was like this macho kind of guy that Mark became friendly with, and every time that Gene was around, Mark would switch from being this warm, nurturing, loving person that we were talking about earlier, and he would try to copy Gene and be this kind of equally macho, trying to impress him kind of thing. And I don't know, I'm getting this impression that Fenton Bresler is trying to make this give us this impression that Gene Scott is kind of like a controlling kind of figure, but he doesn't want to say it too much in the book in case, legal proceedings. So taking that into account, you've got Mark David Chapman going to Atlanta to get these bullets, and surely Gene is breaking rules. He's breaking laws by giving him the bullets because again, Mark hasn't got a gun license for Atlanta, Georgia. His gun license is for Hawaii. So in a way, he's breaking the law. A sheriff is breaking the law, giving these bullets. And apparently, Gene Scott has spoken to the media, and he says the reason that Mark wanted the bullets was because he was scared. Mark was scared for his safety in New York, and he just needed some, in case there were muggers around or robbers or whatever. He just needed something to protect himself. So that's the reason that he gave him these bullets. So he gave him the bullets. They also did a bit of target practice as well, so he could get well oiled in shooting. Got back on the plane, went back to New York, then found out from the doorman that the Lennons weren't around, they weren't available, they weren't going to be coming out of the apartment. Whether that's true or not, whether the doorman was just telling him that because he didn't want him to know. And that brought Mark on a downer. And then apparently what happened is he then decided to go and kill himself. Now, we spoke about this in the previous podcast, how he attempted suicide and he'd considered it. So he went to the Empire State Building and he put the gun to his head to shoot and then changed his mind. So Fenton Bresler is making the suggestion that perhaps what happened there was that he was having some kind of trauma in his head, some kind of crisis, a crisis of alters perhaps. Perhaps he was having kind of this crisis going on inside his head and wanted to kill himself, but he didn't kill himself. He went back to Hawaii and tried to fix himself up, tried to sort his life out. To cut a long story short, he went and saw while he was back in Hawaii, he went to see a shrink while he was in Hawaii, and it's since and Fenton Bresler discovered from a journalist who was looking into the shooting after it occurred. He was looking into the after effects of that. A journalist in Hawaii who was looking for a background story on Mark David Chapman. She did some background work, and she discovered that Mark David Chapman had been to see a shrink while he was in Hawaii. That short spell he was back in Hawaii. And she gave Fenton Bresler the name of a local psychiatrist. Again, Fenton Bresler doesn't give us the name, perhaps because he thinks there might be legal proceedings if he was to give the name in the book. And he says in this book that the local psychiatrist, and this is according to this local journalist at the time by the name of Janice Wolfe, that the local psychiatrist said to Mark David Chapman, and I quote, "Act out your fantasies." This is what the psychiatrist said to Mark David Chapman. Right, now this is where it gets a bit complicated, okay? And I'm going to try and... This is according to Fenton Bresler, okay? And, okay, I'll try not to make this boring. I'll try to keep this as concise and as short, short as possible.
This could never be boring.
Okay.
I'm truly fascinated.
Phew. Right then, with that said, okay. Now, there is a bit of an issue with the air tickets with regards to... You'll remember this from reading the book yourself, but I've had to reread it. I reread this book, especially for this, these podcasts. I read the book maybe last time, maybe 10 years ago, and then when it first came out in the late 80s. But I've had to reread it again. Wow. Okay, here goes. Now, according to the official story, Chapman flew out of Honolulu, Hawaii, on December the 5th. Changed planes en route at Chicago, and then finally landed in New York on December 6th. Now, Bresler challenged that version of events in the book. He claims that Chapman departed from Hawaii on December 2nd landed in Chicago, and then remained there for 3 days before making his way to New York. And to quote from his book, he states, "I believe that he did not leave Honolulu on Friday, 5th of December, to fly on a connecting flight to New York to kill Lennon. He left Honolulu on the previous Tuesday to fly to Chicago. So he didn't leave on the 5th, he left on December 2nd, the previous Tuesday. So he flew to Chicago. That was his destination was Chicago. When he left Honolulu, he had no firm intention of flying on to New York and of killing Lennon. It was only in Chicago that he got this intent, or was finally programmed, Fenton Bresler puts forward, or he was finally programmed to that effect. So reading on again from his book, the ultimate location was not New York, but Chicago. So basically he bought a return ticket for United Airlines Flight 2 at 6:10 p.m. on Tuesday 2nd for Chicago, with a return flight from Chicago on Thursday 18th of December. And that was all. It was purely and simply a visit to Chicago. So basically, in short,
he had changed his mind or made other plans at some point in there.
Yeah, exactly.
In Chicago.
So he bought a one-way. I hope I set that out quite concisely and clearly. It was, he bought the ticket on November 28th, flew on that December 2nd, and it was just to go to Chicago and then go back to Hawaii. That was it. And Bresler's theory is bolstered by Louis L. Sousa, who I mentioned earlier, who carried out his own investigations into Mark David Chapman following the shooting. And he's established also, beyond doubt, in Fenton Bresler's words, he spoke to Louis L. Sousa, who was the captain of the Honolulu police, and he told and established beyond doubt to Fenton Bresler that on November 28th, Mark bought a United Airlines special fare ticket for a return flight out of Honolulu. So like you say, something happened in Chicago to make him change his mind and get a ticket for New York. It was also said at the time, it was also reported at the time, I'll just add, also, that, there was newspaper reports in Hawaii at the time that Mark David Chapman had a grandmother who lived in Chicago, and that he was planning to go and visit her at around that time, just prior to the shooting. So, he was going to stay in Chicago till 18th of December, but then after 3 or 4 so days, like you say, something changed his mind.
Right.
So, another puzzle are the doctors. Do you want to... So, the doctors.
Yes.
Again, what's that all about?
So for over 30 years, there was a doctor named Dr. Lin. He was always kind of the face, if you will, to the media of the doctor who supposedly took care of John Lennon that night. John Lennon came into the emergency room. They started their proceedings, and he goes into great detail and many, 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 many interviews. This man, Dr. Lin, has given countless interviews to media over the years about how he, massaged John's heart in his hand and was trying to get the blood pumping again, and he did everything possible in his power to save his life and was just unsuccessful in doing so. And like I said, for 30 years, this doctor, Dr. Lin, was the one who tried every effort to save John's life. Well, in 2011, all of a sudden, this new doctor, Dr. Halloran, comes out and says, no, actually, I was the one who did that. And Dr. Lin was just kind of like, Dr. Lin was like the head doctor in the emergency department. He was just kind of like the overseer. And Dr. Halloran was the actual doctor who held John Lennon's heart in his hand and tried to revive him in all methods necessary, and was unsuccessful. What's interesting is the story is exactly the same. The story does not change, only the doctors. So, it's odd to me that for 30 years, this Dr. Halloran, who supposedly at least was the actual doctor who did all of these things, didn't stand up before that. And until 2011, 31 years after this happened. And Dr. Lynn kind of took all the notoriety, took all of the credit for doing these things, and even had the nurses that were on the scene at the time interview with him and, collaborate, saying, yes, this is what happened. And I was there, and Dr. Lynn did all these things. And nobody ever came forward at all to say that wasn't the case whatsoever. So it's a very, very interesting situation. There was a movie that came out, I want to say 2012, called The Lennon Report. And it got a lot of kind of controversy surrounding it, a lot of critics, because it was the actual movie about the story of what happened on December 8th, 1980, and just the hospital situation and Yoko Ono, just the whole mess that surrounded that night. And it was the Lennon Report in 2012 that came out was the first mainstream movie or anything that actually claimed that Dr. Halloran was the real doctor that was on the scene that night, and not Dr. Lynn. And ever since that came out, Dr. Lynn has never contested that Dr. Halloran was the actual doctor. He's kind of faded into obscurity from this point, but it's just another layer of the absolute strangeness that goes along with this entire story. How for 30 years, one doctor can say, it was me, I did it. And, look at me, and I'm going to do all the interviews, and I'm going to be the face of all of this. And then come to find out that he wasn't even the right doctor. And nobody said anything. And nobody, pointed out that wasn't in fact true. And even the doctor who really was there, Dr. Halloran, didn't say anything for 30 years. So it's just another odd story that goes along with so many other odd stories that revolve around this very odd story.
It's just, yeah,
so,
it's just like this ghost of weirdness that just overhangs this entire event,
Right. How do you even explain that? How do you even accept that and then be like, oh, okay. Maybe after 30 years, they figure people aren't as interested in this anymore, or aren't interested at all, or it's just something that's kind of by the wayside. So now we can kind of come out with the truth. But what? I just don't understand how there wasn't more of a stink made about that. Who is this Dr. Lynn, and how could he possibly be the face of this for all this time, and then he actually wasn't even there? It's just weird. Very strange. And it's also strange that the story actually did not change at all. It was just the doctor himself. It was like he was replaced by this Dr. Halloran.
And apparently Dr. Stephen Lynn didn't turn up until right towards the end of the resuscitation attempt. He kind of pretty much breezed in towards the end. He was at home and he was called in, and he just came in after all the attempts to revive Lennon had pretty much come to a close, already happened. So he just kind of stood there and watched in the background, and they say it was Halloran who was doing everything, basically. He was doing pretty much everything. Right. The thing is, where'd you go with this? I mean, for a start, like as you say, why didn't anybody come forward before? 30 years and no one comes forward to say, to put their hand up and say, wait a minute, that's not how it happened. I was there. A couple of the nurses have since been interviewed in the light of this Lennon report film that came out. There was a bit of a kind of like a press, kind of like a media kind of push for this film when it came out, and Halloran was interviewed by the media when the film was going to come out, and so were a couple of the nurses that were there, and they've confirmed that yes, it wasn't Dr. Stephen Lynn, it was it was Halloran. So why didn't the nurses come forward before? And apparently, from what I've gathered from what one of the nurses has said, whose name escapes me, she said that she felt it wasn't professional to do so. It wasn't her place to come forward and to contradict basically Dr. Stephen Lynn because he was basically the director of the ER. I think he was, like you say, he was the head of it, of the Roosevelt Hospital, I think it was. Right. So but what about anybody else? There were other people in that room. There were other doctors, there were other nurses, there were other staffers that were around that ER that night who could have come forward and said, wait a minute, that's not how it happened. But it just, it's just, Dr. Stephen Lynn is, when, if anyone wants to see him, they can actually, he's the actual man. Whenever you watch these news reports looking back at the shooting, he's the doctor that you'll find footage of. I'm sure he'll be on YouTube. Whenever they do these retrospective documentaries or news reports, they show this footage of this doctor standing outside the hospital announcing John Lennon's death, confirming it officially to the press who are waiting outside. That's Dr. Stephen Lynn. That footage that you can find on YouTube, I'm sure, that's who he is. And that's the image that was always ingrained in my memory from being a child in 1980 to fairly more recent years, when it comes to the doctor who looked after Lennon in the hospital, quote unquote. I've always got that man's face embedded in my memory as to be the man who was there. But basically, it appears not to be the case. According to Halloran, the reason that he didn't come out before 2010, because he's, as I say, he's spoken in interviews, apparently his reasoning for that, whether you want to believe him or not, is because, first off, Dr. Stephen Lynn approached Halloran, so Halloran claims, and said to him on the night that Lennon died, he said, look, the hospital board, the Board of Governors, want someone to go outside and announce to the press officially that John Lennon has died. And apparently Halloran says that Lynn offered to Halloran the opportunity, if you like to call it that, if you want to word it like that, to do that. And Halloran said no, because all he wanted to do, quote unquote, was to crawl under a rock. Basically, he didn't want to stand out there and get kind of blamed for not saving John Lennon, for trying to save him, to resuscitate him, and failing. He didn't want people to see him as having failed. He just couldn't handle it. So instead, Dr. Stephen Lynn went out there. And it was only years later that Halloran lived with that and was happy that Dr. Stephen Lynn was taking the credit in the mainstream news for the history of how it all turned out with Dr. Stephen Lynn at the centre of the resuscitation. He was happy with that until he heard about the massaging of the heart, when it was only in later years, apparently, in the 2000s, late 2000s, around that time, that Dr. Stephen Lynn then began to tell the press that he was the one that was massaging John Lennon's heart, trying to resuscitate it. And it was at that point Halloran said, no, wait a minute, you're going too far now. You're really, really going too far. I'm going to have to... But then again, even then, my suspicious mind, I do wonder whether they were trying to cover up Dr. Halloran, because if you recall in the previous podcast, we were talking about the entry wounds of the bullets and how the official account, according to the death certificate and also to the official accounts, is that Lennon took 4 bullets in the back. They entered his back in the shoulder and the lung area and came out. They went in the back. But if you recall in the first podcast, I mentioned that Halloran said that according to him, and he said this quite recently, that the bullet wounds went in through his chest, the front. Now, could it be that he wasn't offered the chance to go outside and announce it to the press? Is it possible that perhaps they didn't want him to tell the world's media that the bullet wounds had come from the front, which would then mean, of course, that there was this other gunman or gunmen in the vicinity of the area that were actually doing the shooting, and that it wasn't Mark David Chapman at all.
Right.
You know,
could very well be, like I said, that, you know, the story really hasn't changed. That obviously that part is different, but you know, it's like there's this narrative that they that is either completely true and, you know, everybody's accounts are exactly the same, or it's a narrative that was fed to them. You know, we need to say this so that it does, you know, for whatever reason that they gave, it doesn't cause a stir, or this is just the simplest explanation, or whatever has happened. Because if you recall, like we had said also in the first podcast there, that people weren't even recognizing that this was John Lennon, from the police officers that drove him there to the nurses and the doctors that worked on him once he was there. You know, it's just, there's all different just different oddities around the entire situation. I don't know how to explain it any better than that. There's just every single little step from this entire night. There's like, well, wait a minute, what about this? And wait a minute, what about this? And wait a minute, what about this? You know, all the way down through the entire story to make you wonder, well, what really happened? Because there's just so much weirdness going around this whole story. So
yeah, I mean, I was thinking that as well, that maybe one of the other reasons that they wanted to keep Halloran down in terms of talking out so early on, perhaps they now think, oh, you know, perhaps they're thinking to themselves, oh, okay, let's let, you know, Halloran speak now because it's 40 years after the fact, and you know, maybe time has killed a lot of interest in this. I don't know,
right.
But you know, but the other thing, like you say, is that Halloran himself, when Lennon was brought in on the stretcher, somebody said, one of the nurses, and it's in the movie actually, in the Lennon report. If you can watch it online, do watch it, because you'll watch it and think, wait a minute, this like it's like they're giving out a few clues for people that are, you know, of a conspiratorial mind. And one of the nurses is looking over the stretcher as they're resuscitating, and she says, "Gee, that looks like John Lennon." And Dr. Halloran says, no. And again, if you watch the Lennon report, and I saw another little weird, well, it seems weird to me, and then I checked it out after the film, after watching it, and apparently it's true, that you remember when they, I'm not sure, you know, remember the Monday Night Football game when the whole of America found out that John Lennon had been shot. Right. And when it was announced on the football program, well, apparently that they got the information from a reporter for Channel 7 News, I think it was, in the US, and it just so happens that reporter had been in a motorcycle accident that night and had ended up on a stretcher with a broken leg, I think, in the Roosevelt Hospital. Right. And he saw Lennon being stretchered in and thought, what's going on here? Why are they making such... He didn't recognise... Again, another person who didn't recognise Lennon straight away. He just remembers seeing this stretcher coming in and all this fuss being put over this one person. And he goes... And his journalistic brain was like, what's going on here? That's a bit odd, all this fuss for one person. And so, again, you know, it's all too neat, isn't it? That... It on the night, he just happens to, this reporter just happens to have a motorcycle accident on the night that John Lennon ends up in the same hospital. Right. And, oh, look, he just so happens then to ring up, to make a report and then ring up to get this announcement made on the Monday Night Football programme. So, again, it's all coincidence, quote unquote. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
It's all...
Right. And see, I mean, we're talking after 11 o'clock. I think John Lennon was officially pronounced dead at 11:15 by the hospital staff there. And so this is 11:15 p.m. on a Monday night, and there's still football going on like that. To me, that must have been a really, really long game. What would have happened if the Monday Night Football wasn't going on? would they have waited until the next day to make this, make this announcement? Probably not, but they probably would have done a news special interruption broadcast or something. But it's just everything seemingly works out so perfectly to where, it almost, I hate to say it this way, but almost as if it was planned. It went according to how it was supposed to, in almost every sense possible. So, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay. Well, here's some more high weirdness. You know about the Kenneth Anger angle, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah, Kenneth Anger, of course, who is this Aleister Crowleyite, who's a disciple of Crowley, an occult filmmaker, a quote-unquote satanic filmmaker, especially in the 1960s. He was very connected to the Rolling Stones and is said to have been an influence on the song Sympathy for the Devil. He was also very personally connected to Bobby Beausoleil before Bobby went and joined Manson's so-called family and was one of the killers in the so-called Manson murders. So a very interesting character, an occult filmmaker. I think it was... There's loads of claims online about the fact, or this report, whether it's true or not, that Mark David Chapman went to visit, or he attended a film lecture in Hawaii where Kenneth Anger was the main speaker. Mm-hmm. And he approached, well, it depends which claim you look at.
Right.
He approached, one claim is that he approached Kenneth Anger after the end of the lecture and kept throwing questions at Kenneth Anger. And this was 6 weeks before the shooting. He approached Kenneth Anger and was throwing questions at Kenneth Anger about John Lennon and Yoko Ono, and trying to test Kenneth Anger's knowledge of John and Yoko. Now that claim comes, it's in a book I've got next to me actually. It's called Take a Walk on the Dark Side, Rock and Roll Myths, Legends and Curses by R. Gary Patterson. And he attributes that claim to the Globe newspaper, the December 30th, 1980 edition, and he even puts the page number, the Globe newspaper. I don't know much about the Globe newspaper. I think it's an American newspaper. It looks like a trashy kind of thing, like a kind of National Enquirer.
Like a tabloid, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Tabloidy thing, yeah, like news stories mixed in with kind of things like maybe a UFO lands on the White House and loads of bananas invade Earth kind of stories,
right.
So you teetering on whether it's true or not, this Kenneth Anger thing.
Right.
I've seen it mentioned in other websites and books and articles, but I think they're all drawing their particular claims from that one.
Right.
It's a shame I can't get.
It's kind of like we had talked about before, the game of telephone, where it starts here, and then somebody else tells it a little bit differently, and somebody else tells it a little bit differently, and then by the time you get to 40 years later, who knows how it started or where it came from or the original source of that. But to anybody who's listening to this, if they have any information, I've been trying to track down an original, real, confirmable source for that information right there, because you would think that Kenneth Anger himself would have said that, or something somewhere to where they would get that idea and that impression from that. So
I don't know Kenneth Anger very well, but from the research that I've done in the past with regards to the Rolling Stones for a couple of articles that I wrote for my Conspiromedia website, I looked a little bit into Kenneth Anger, and he does strike me as the kind of person who does like to shout about things.
Right.
So he would be the kind of person who would say in interviews to people, "Hey, did you know that Mark Chapman came to my lecture, weeks before he..." But from, like you say, I haven't been able to find any quote directly from him that happened. And there's also another claim, and I don't know how true this is, and this is in the book Sinister Forces, The Manson Secret by Peter Lavender. He claims that Chapman approached Anger at this event, at this lecture, or whatever it was, and gave him some, and gifted him with some live bullets.
Yes.
Gave him some live bullets.
Right.
I don't know.
But where
I
he
really,
got that information from, who knows as well. Peter Levenda is an interesting character. We could do a whole other podcast on him sometime. But he's also, I think, kind of the type. He prides himself in, thinking that he's, well connected with all of these people, and
right.
he gets his information because he is so well connected. So, who knows? He kind of embellishes, I think, a little bit here and there. But so who knows if that's a real story or just something that has come out since that, just to make a good story, a storytelling. And but yeah, anybody who's listening, if you have any information, I'd really like to know about that. So
please.
Yeah.
And another weird thing that took place, and this is according to David Bowie, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just throw David Bowie's name in from nowhere there. Apparently, at the time, December 8th, 1980, he was on Broadway. He was appearing in the stage version of The Elephant Man.
Mm-hmm.
I think he'd started his run on Broadway. I think he was playing the lead role of The Elephant Man, and that started in September, I think, of 1980, and it was still going in December. And according to David Bowie, he was contacted by detectives after the shooting and was told by detectives that he was second on Chapman's list,
right,
on his hit list, because he had a hit list. We haven't actually got to that, have we? But he did have a hit list, apparently.
Yep.
And yeah, so that freaked Bowie out. And it also turns out, and I don't know how he found this out, according to David Bowie, Chapman had booked a front row ticket to watch The Elephant Man for December 9th, the next night,
mm-hmm,
and for a front row seat. And it just so happens, so Bowie claims, that John and Yoko had also booked front row seats for that very night as well.
Huh.
So the way that Bowie describes it is he was performing that night on stage, and as he was looking out into the auditorium, he could see 3 empty seats in the front row where these guys should have been sitting, which is very odd.
Oh man, that gave me the creeps.
And can you imagine being in David Bowie's shoes, man?
Right.
God. Yeah, so there was this list, wasn't there, that the police apparently found that Mark David Chapman had a hit list.
Right.
I think the names that have been bandied around was Ronald Reagan was on that list.
Yeah.
I think. I'm doing this off the top of my head because I can't quite remember. I think Paul McCartney was on that list.
Yeah, I'm trying to pick it up. Johnny Carson,
right. Elizabeth Taylor.
Mm-hmm. Ronald Reagan, I think you mentioned.
Yeah, George C. Scott, I think, as well, was on that list. He had a hit list that he gave to police on the day that he was arrested. He gave it to that Arthur O'Connor, I think, that we were mentioning earlier. And also, there's a strange case with James Taylor as well, which is just, again, this just came out in recent years. Again, James Taylor didn't mention this till quite recently. I think It was 2015, and that's James Taylor is mentioned in a couple of, I think it was on a BBC interview about 5 or so years ago, and also on Howard Stern's radio show. He mentioned that he was actually accosted by Mark David Chapman the day before the shooting in a subway station. What happened was the way I remember the way that James Taylor explained it was he was coming off the train. He can't remember if Chapman was on the train and he was coming off at the same time, or whether they bumped into each other underneath in the subway on the platform, but they bumped into each other. And the way that James Taylor explains it is that he looked at Chapman, and Chapman was all sweaty, agitated, talking kind of gobbledygook, and he explains how he got this bad vibe from him, he looked like he hadn't been to sleep. His eyes were dilated, and he was talking all this freaky stuff about, kind of things like, hey man, I know this person, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and I'm going to sort out this bit of business, and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, and I'm going to babble, 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 just rambling.
Right.
And James Taylor, the way he explains it was he got, well, as you would expect, he got a bit freaked out by this, kind of made his excuses, and then kind of went away and kind of made a very quick exit. And then it was the next evening, I think, he was on the telephone. And again, it's these weird things. Apparently, he was a neighbour at the Dakota. He wasn't in the Dakota, but James Taylor had lived in an apartment just about a building away or something like this.
Right.
Pretty much.
I think, I could be mistaken on this, but I think so. The Dakota building has been there a very long time, since the 1800s.
Yeah.
It's an old building, and they used to have a building next door where you would park your horses and your
Carriages.
Your carriages, exactly. And it was like a separate building that was located behind the Dakota. And that had been there for years and years and years. And I think until the 1960s or the 70s, they converted that into condominiums. And the condominium that used to be the old stable for the Dakota is now called the Harrison. Which is just kind of interesting.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
But I think James Taylor lived in the Harrison, which was directly behind the Dakota building that used to be used as a stable of sorts for the Dakota building residents. So pretty close.
And another weird thing, another connection, the way he describes it, he heard the shots when he was in this apartment in the Harrison. And he was on the phone to Peter Asher's wife. So again, we've got the Ashers, of course, the McCartney connection to Jane Asher, his girlfriend in the 60s. And then we've spoken about the infamous Asher family in previous editions of Magical Mystery Talk, of course, and what have you. So I think Peter Asher was actually James Taylor's manager, because the way it happened was when the Beatles started Apple Records in 1968, 67, 68, they signed a then unknown James Taylor, and I think they released, his first album, which bombed. It wasn't a commercial success, and I think Peter Asher was working, Jane Asher's brother was working at Apple as kind of like a talent scout, and he took on the role of manager of James Taylor. So so there was this relationship. So here we are. We've got December the 8th. In the Harrison, James Taylor's talking on the phone to Peter Asher's wife, and the way he describes it, he hears these shots ring out. 5 shots, he says. 5 shots ring out, and the quote I've got here, which he said to Peter Asher's wife on the phone, he says to her, "I think the cops have just shot someone down on the street," and she said, "How do you know it's the cops?" And James Taylor said, "Well, it was 5 in a row. They emptied the gun, one under the hammer, and then emptied the gun. I've been told that's how it goes down." So, that sounds like a professional, doesn't it? Someone who's well trained. So, so he heard these shots, and then he put the phone down, and then Peter Asher's wife called 15, 20 minutes later and told him that, that was John Lennon that had been shot. So he'd actually heard John Lennon being shot, from downstairs outside in the street, his neighbour. So, weird. Oh, and another thing, talking of neighbours, did you know that Dr. Stephen Lynn was a friend of the Lennons? He was actually a neighbour. Oh. And that his child, his daughter, his son used to go to school with Sean.
Oh, how funny. No, I did not know that.
I've just remembered
Interesting.
that. Yeah.
Interesting.
So, again, these weird things,
So then, I hate to assume this way, but that means that he must have had quite a bit of money after Len.
Yeah,
right?
Well, if he was living in that area, which is well-to-do.
Very much so. Interesting, huh?
Really weird.
Well, there you have it.
And with regards to James Taylor, I don't know how much you take, how much respect you've got for this kind of thing, but have you heard of the website famouskin.com? I
have not.
It's a website which claims to be very well researched. It's basically a website where you can find the famous kin of famous people. It's their genealogy.
Interesting.
And
Okay.
I looked at Mark David Chapman's, and the list, you can find it if you go to famouskin.com. I typed in Mark David Chapman because I'd read somewhere a quote that he was related to someone that was closely involved with this whole mess that we're talking about now. And goodness, if this is true, this is absolutely mind-boggling. Apparently, there's a huge list here, and I'm just skimming through it now. We've got Franklin D. Roosevelt. We've got J.P. Morgan. We've also got Humphrey Bogart, George Hamilton, the actor, Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister. We've also got John Foster Dulles.
Ralph Waldo Emerson. I'm looking it up here.
John Kerry, Alan Dulles, the 5th director of the CIA. And check this out, if you want linkages. James Taylor, Nancy Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and John Hinckley.
Oh, wow. J.P. Morgan. Wow. Yeah.
Are you looking at that list now? Have you got it on your computer?
I couldn't help myself.
Gloria Vanderbilt, Katharine Hepburn. I'm looking at the list here. It just goes on and on. Nelson Rockefeller, Winthrop Rockefeller.
Wow.
If this is true, Grace Slick from Jefferson Airplane, Jefferson Starship, Sarah Palin, Richard Gere, John Wayne,
Boris
Christopher
Johnson
Reeve,
is on
Boris
there.
Johnson, yeah.
Wow.
Anderson Cooper from CNN. Wow.
Yeah.
Just wow.
That's a lot. Now,
That's a lot.
I am sure you're familiar with the genealogies of every U.S. president that we've ever had can be linked back to King John of England. I have an article on it, the phony King of England. But there's a pretty well-established theory out there that claims that pretty much any famous person, anybody who has any kind of notoriety or any kind of presence within, being famous or wealthy or what have you, are all kind of belong to the same few bloodlines that are out there. And so if that is the case, and there really is a lot of research that has been done to that, and it really does seem the case, and you could always, I guess, lay claim to say, if you go back far enough, everybody's related to everybody, right?
Yeah.
But
yeah.
it just seems, very strange how a lot of the same family of people of the same kind of bloodlines keep coming up over and over and over. But if this truly is the case, and he's, related to the likes of John Kerry and Boris Johnson and, all of these people who keep coming up over and over and over again, then chances are that, he was absolutely chosen for a reason.
Yeah.
He definitely had that bloodline in him, and they could probably manipulate him in ways that, who knows? Or he did it all on his own accord. I mean, who knows at this point? But yeah, that's too non-coincidental for me.
Yeah.
So
and what do you make of this? I know you've written about this in one of your articles. This weird quote that Ringo Starr gave to Yoko when he arrived at the Dakota just a day or two after the killing.
It was that evening. It wasn't a day.
It was that evening, was it? Yeah. It's all.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's also mentioned in Fenton Bresler's book,
right?
Where Ringo and Barbara, his wife, arrived, or his fiance at the time, his wife now, arrived at the Dakota to console Yoko.
Right.
And what was it? Yoko wouldn't allow Barbara to come in.
Right.
And then I've got the quote here, and this is what Ringo is quoted as saying. He said to Yoko, when Yoko said no, Barbara's not coming in. Right. Ringo replied by saying, "Look, it was you who started all this. We're both coming in."
Right.
What's that all about?
Who knows? And what's interesting too is, by that point, they had I think they were in the Bahamas. Ringo and Barbara were in the Bahamas, and they heard the news. I think on that, that Monday Night Football or something. Obviously, the news had gotten to them, and they immediately hopped on a flight to New York, which must have been, I mean, they must have gotten there at, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning or something like that. But anyhow, so there were several witnesses that there are a lot of people that had gathered in front of the Dakota by that point. And they were doing, candlelight vigils
Yeah.
and singing songs and all this kind of thing. And then when Ringo showed up, I mean, there were several people who said this conversation took place. So it definitely happened. It's not just a hearsay kind of thing.
Yeah.
And you might be able to chalk it up to that comment as being something like, well, during the Beatles time, John always made sure that Yoko, was there, and every time the boys put up a protest, he's like, well, too bad Yoko's staying. But it didn't seem to be in that context to me. I mean,
No.
what did she start exactly, and why? And why would Barbara's just going to sit outside the gates of the Dakota? Like, really? Like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Of course she's going to come in. She's not going to be thrown to the wolves of the
That
John
part
Lennon
doesn't
fans,
quite.
you know?
Yeah, that part doesn't quite surprise me.
Right.
I don't know Yoko Ono, but that part doesn't surprise me. But what really irks me is, what does he mean by you started all this?
Right. This what does this mean? Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's also that claim, and and this kind of goes down the Yoko Ono kind of thing again. But you got to ask. Well, I've got to. There's rumours that she'd can't. I don't know how true this is. This is another rumour that's been going on for years, and that's to do with this bodyguard thing. Apparently, Yoko Ono, the rumour is, or the story is that John Lennon did have a bodyguard, but on the day that he was shot, she'd cancelled it for that day, or something along those lines. I don't know if you've heard of that, but
Yeah, I don't know about the bodyguard part, but John had a personal assistant by the name of Fred Seaman.
yeah,
And Fred Seaman only worked for the Ono Lennons, I think for 5 years, 4 or 5 years, something like that. But the last few years there, and he was almost always with John. He was a personal assistant. I don't know about bodyguard, but he was almost a lookalike. He looked a lot like John, and so that was. But he went on vacations with them, and was pretty much always with John. And that night, he was given suddenly, like without explanation, he was given the night off. He didn't, it wasn't supposed. He wasn't supposed to have the night off. It was just kind of like, oh, you want the night off? Go ahead. At Yoko's request. So, and he's written a book, the Last Days of John Lennon, and he even claims in that book that it was kind of strange. It was like he wasn't expecting to have this day off, but it was offered. Oh, sure, okay, I'll take the day off. And normally, Fred Seaman would have been their driver. He was the one who drove John around, and Yoko at times as well. And he was their driver. He did everything. He was like a gopher. He did everything for them. So yeah, just very odd. People were given the days off, the night off that weren't suspecting to have that night off, and things were just different and weren't going to their very scheduled routine that they always had. So,
and I don't know if you want to go down this route, but there's also, I can't remember if we mentioned this in the previous podcast, but Jose Padermo is said to have been part of Operation 40 and the Bay of Pigs, CIA. So you've got an anti-Castro Cuban exile who joins the CIA. And I can't remember if you mentioned it in the previous podcast. I know you've mentioned it before in other Magical Mystery Talks. This link that Yoko has to Cuba.
Oh, yes. Well, her sister is actually the link to Cuba, but I guess by default that kind of makes Yoko attached to Cuba as well. But Yoko's sister is married to, I can't even recall his name at the moment. Is married to a man who was like a Castro sympathizer, and I believe he's Polish, but he's the only non-Cuban that has been allowed access to all of the Cuban government documents, and is a very good friend with or was anyway with Fidel Castro, and they did social events together and just all sorts of odd things, and that was um, Yoko Ono's sister's husband. So there, I mean, that's a very close connection there, directly to Fidel Castro in many, many ways. And so, just the fact that they say, it's alleged that Jose Padormo was anti-Castro and was part of the Bay of Pigs and the Brigade 40 and all of that, where they were trying, at least supposedly, to assassinate Fidel Castro at that time. It's kind of like a conflict of interest. Like, why was Jose Padormo, hired to be a security guard doorman of the Dakota? And, John and Yoko having that conflict of interest there. It's just very kind of another oddity on top of the odd story.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It might be nothing, but I think it's worth. I think it's worth mentioning,
right?
Because it's just,
and you have to remember too, Yoko, was her family is a big aristocratic banking family.
Yeah.
I mean, they had lots and lots of money and were very well to do and had lots of connections, and being in Japan. I think Yoko was born in 1931 or 32, something like that.
Yeah,
so I mean, at the height of, that was World War II era, and Japan and Pearl Harbor, which is also the anniversary of Pearl Harbor is the day before John Lennon was assassinated. Probably just coincidence, but it's just all kinds of just oddities
and you have Mark David Chapman, who was in Hawaii, which is near Pearl Harbor. So
who also happened to marry a Japanese woman. Mark David Chapman married. So just very strange coincidences and oddities there. A lot of detail to get into that's probably not best for this podcast, but maybe even for a future one, as far as Yoko.
I think it was her father, Yoko's father. It was on her father's side. Her father was related to one of the emperors of Japan. And I think both sides, maternal and paternal, were related to samurai, ancient samurai, and and a huge banking family. So again, if you're talking about, as we were saying earlier, people that have been adopted, if you like, have been born to carry out something, pre-planned, some agenda. Well, there you go. Shall we round it off? Have you got anything else to add? I've got a couple of little bits to round this off with. Have you got anything to like to tidy up?
Not too much. I think it just kind of worth mentioning that in the past, it's always kind of worried me to talk about Yoko. I really hesitate to publish anything on my website about Yoko, but I have. She has really kept with this. Well, she has really made this Lennon legacy that has been carried. I don't want to say anything negative about her, but it really seems like she's kind of played on this entire situation, and she's made a ton of money off of the Lennon legacy, and and it's 100% all hers. You know what I mean? Like, she hasn't shared it with any of John's family. She hasn't even Julian. She's kept things from him. And
well, it was John's first wife, wasn't it, Cynthia, who claims that. Probably with good reason, I should think, judging from what I've seen myself. Not that I'm an insider or anything, but certainly what she claimed is that Lennon's family, like the Liverpool Lennons, have received much to nothing.
Nothing. In fact, I believe that John bought a home for his sister out there when he was alive, and Yoko just took it away, like, oh, that's no longer available to you, kind of thing, and has just done some, in my opinion, just some nasty things, and maybe there's more to the story that we don't know about, but
And
But
didn't
it just seems she just seems very cold and nasty when it comes to, you know, this situation, and and kind of just profiteering off of things that I would never suspect somebody who really truly, loved and admired and cared for this person to do things of that sort. But anyhow, that's me, and I'm not there. I don't know, but she has brought forth a few lawsuits in recent years that are interesting. She's sued poor Fred Seaman that we were just talking about. Um, at least 3 times now, and the most recent one was just a couple of months ago. Anytime it seems he gives an interview or tries to open his mouth for any reason, she's right there with, slapping a lawsuit on him to kind of keep him quiet. So that's always kind of an interesting story, little rabbit hole to go down if you've ever explored in that direction. He literally like can't talk. He's been gagged his entire time. He's not even allowed to like think about his time with the Lennon, Ono Lennons there. But there's that, and she also had a lawsuit against her driver, who it's unclear, but it seems like she hired another driver after the murder of John Lennon, but again, it's unclear. It's not sure. But his name is Coral Carson, and which always kind of struck me as funny because, in the Asian culture, it's always the son at the end, and car son. So the driver was the car son. Anyway.
yeah.
You get what I'm saying?
I get it. Yeah. Oh, I just got it. Yeah.
But he was also her bodyguard and kind of a confidant, and apparently he tried to use extortion against Yoko, and was going to release all of his information. Supposedly he had all these tapes of her saying things, and was going to release them to the press if she didn't give him, X amount of dollars and let him go back to his home country of Turkey, because she treated him so badly, at least according to him. And it ended up that he got deported, and obviously didn't get the money he was asking for, but he actually got charged with second-degree larceny, which is also interesting because, if you're asking for millions of dollars and threatening to do all these things, it probably shouldn't be second-degree larceny. But anyhow, so lots of lawsuits that have come out after this whole situation by Yoko herself. Just it kind of seems to keep people from talking or revealing anything that's too personal or to the effect of what exactly might have happened that day or the days leading up to it. So
there was also Jack Douglas, who was the producer of the Double Fantasy album. Yeah. He took her to court as well, I think, over unpaid royalties for that album, and also the posthumous one, Milk and Honey. And I wrote an article on my site, The Occult Beatles, it was about a year ago, maybe a little bit less, regarding those claims that he's put forward, that when he took her to court to get these alleged unpaid royalties, I don't know if he did in the end, what the outcome of that case was, but he claims he was being followed. He had his house, he had certain items in his house that went missing when certain friends of his and Yoko's turned up for quote-unquote social calls just to see how he was doing, and then all of a sudden all these valuable things went missing when the people left. I won't mention the names that he mentions, but he certainly mentions names. I won't, but and he claims that one of the people that was following him and giving him the heebie-jeebies, kind of putting the frighteners on him, was an ex-FBI operative, someone who used to work for the FBI, which is quite kind of, if it's true, it's kind of ironic that you had Lennon, who was followed all those years, monitored by the FBI, as has been shown since from the declassified documents, and Yoko ends up allegedly hiring someone from that very same organisation, to put the frighteners on somebody else, to monitor someone else.
Right.
yeah, just weird stuff going down all the way, really.
Yeah, and wasn't Jack Douglas, didn't he say that he had just a couple of days when I think they were recording Walking on Thin Ice, or they were, doing some other recordings at that time. And something had come up, some kind of statement John had said. And he said that and Jack Douglas had said it was too not embarrassing, but too shocking. And he decided it was all being recorded, but he decided to erase it. Have you heard that story?
Yeah, I have heard that story. Yeah, I have heard that. Yeah.
And for years, I think people kind of assumed when he would say that story that he said something bad, maybe about Yoko. But then he just came out, less than 10 years ago and said, no, it had nothing to do with Yoko. It had something to do with his death. And this, of course, he was still alive. So, I mean, at that point. So it just very strange. And he's never elaborated really on that. He just said that it was just so shocking and so horrifying that he felt he needed to erase it. And so, it just makes you wonder, like, what could have been so horrifying that he erased it? Like that's.
And he's also one of the people who claimed in later years that Paul McCartney, if that's who it is, if that is the Paul McCartney, that John and Paul were actually writing together in those last days, in those last weeks. Paul was turning up to the Dakota and writing songs with John, and with a view to a Beatles reunion, possibly in 1981. And that was confirmed also by a radio presenter by the name of Richard Skinner, who's a BBC presenter back in the 80s. He was a DJ on Radio 1 on the BBC. And he claimed in a recent-ish interview that on the day that John was shot, he phoned McCartney. McCartney wouldn't speak on the air. Skinner wanted him to make a statement live to the radio, and McCartney wouldn't do it. But in a private conversation, Richard Skinner claims that McCartney said to him that 1981 was going to be the year that there was going to be a Beatles reunion, that Paul and John was coming back to the UK for the first time in 10 years to meet with Paul in the studio, and they'd actually booked studio time. This is according to what Richard Skinner claims that he heard from McCartney in this phone conversation, that they'd actually booked studio time in New York. And the way that Richard Skinner explains it, the way he sketches it out, is John Lennon shouldn't have even been in New York on that day. He was meant to be somewhere else. But he was right. So they booked studio time for that day that he was shot. He was actually booked to be in a studio with Paul, but they double booked. There'd been a mess up with the booking, so they didn't get that booking in the end because there'd been some kind of confusion with someone else booking the same date. So they rearranged the date, I think for 1981 maybe, I'm not sure. But whatever, it turns out that from what Richard Skinner claims McCartney told him, John Lennon shouldn't have even been in New York at the record plant on that day. He should have been with Paul McCartney somewhere else. So again, if there had been a Beatles reunion, can you imagine what effect that would have had on the world for the so-called powers that be? Would they have wanted that? I don't know. I'm not going to go down that road. We've been down this road before in previous podcasts, and it's a huge, long and winding road, pardon the pun. But okay, well, I'm going. I think we should wrap it up. I've just got one topical piece, fairly topical piece of related news to kind of round it off with, and that's to do with Mark David Chapman again. His parole back in August 2020, his parole was denied for the 11th time. Apparently, I've printed out the news story here. It says John Lennon's killer Mark Chapman has been denied parole for the 11th time. The 65-year-old was interviewed by a parole board in New York on August 19th and has since had his appeal turned down. Chapman is currently serving a 20 years to life sentence, having pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Chapman will now remain behind bars for at least another 2 years, with his next hearing scheduled for August 2022. He was first eligible for parole in 2000. The killer's appeal was last turned down in August 2018 when the parole board explained of their decision. You admittedly carefully planned and executed the murder of a world-famous person for no reason other than to gain notoriety. There we go again. While no one person's life is any more valuable than another's life, the fact that you chose someone who was not only a world-renowned person and beloved by millions, regardless of the pain and suffering you would cause to his family, friends, and so many others, you demonstrated a callous disregard for the sanctity of human life and the pain and suffering of others. During that hearing, Chapman explained that he felt more and more shame every year since committing the crime. 30 years ago, he said, I couldn't say I felt shame, and I now know what shame is, he said. So there you go. That's a topical piece there.
Right. And notice not only where was the gained fame and notoriety, but he carefully and meticulously planned to murder this person, and yet he was in there for second-degree murder, which means it was unplanned. Yeah. So, yeah. Strange.
Weird. Another weird one. Okay, thanks, Desiree. It's been brilliant, and I hope people listening are liking it too. So, I hope we've been okay and we've done our job. Can I close with a quote from John Lennon from 1972?
Of course.
Right, he said, "Listen, if anything happens to Yoko and me, it was not an accident."
Right.